How does a single US regulatory tweet quietly redraw the industrial map of Southeast Asia overnight? Fast fashion giant Shein leased a massive logistics hub near Ho Chi Minh City to insulate itself from trade wars. Just over a year later, that giant facility sits two-thirds empty, while trade crackdowns targeting Vietnam have unexpectedly handed regional competitors like Cambodia and Indonesia a 3-year head start. Act 1. The warehouse that emptied itself. What happens when a global company's 2-year-old supply chain bet pays off only halfway? Across Southeast Asia, multinational corporations have been racing to diversify away from Chinese manufacturing. But when boardroom strategy collides with shifting trade policy on the factory floor, high-profile investments can unravel far quicker than they were built. In late July 2026, reporters visited a major logistics complex just outside Ho Chi Minh City. They found a handful of workers on site and only a few parked trucks scattered across empty yards. While neighboring warehouses run by local tenants were alive with forklift traffic and worker chatter, Shein's sprawling facility was eerily quiet. At its peak, this single site covered 15 hectares, roughly equivalent to 21 football pitches, and employed thousands of local workers. Today, Shein has quietly slashed its lease down to 6 hectares, with sources confirming only a third of the original floor plan is in active use. Mass layoffs hit in April 2026, leaving some warehouse teams with just 1 in 4 of their original staff. What was originally built to be Shein's ultimate hedge against global trade disruption has turned into something very different. It stands today as a quiet monument to how quickly corporate hedging strategies can fall apart when trade rules shift underneath them. Act 2. 2 years, 1 reversed bet. To understand why Shein made such an aggressive commitment to Vietnam in the first place, we have to rewind to late 2024. The corporate logic seemed ironclad at the time, but the regulatory ground was already beginning to move. Following Donald Trump's return to the White House, Washington made it clear that the de minimis rule, which allowed shipments under $800 to enter the United States entirely duty-free, was ending for Chinese goods, as tariffs on Chinese products rocketed toward 145% by April 2025. Shifting packaging and export logistics into Vietnam looked like simple, bulletproof insurance. Then, in July 2025, the nature of that insurance fundamentally changed. Washington abolished the duty-free exemption entirely, extending the rule to every country shipping small parcels into America. Under the new tariff math, a knitted dress faces a base duty of 16% whether it comes from Vietnam or China, while Chinese goods face additional tariffs bringing their effective rate to around 33.5%. Vietnam's remaining margin was no longer wide enough to justify 15 hectares of warehouse space. The thousands of Vietnamese logistics workers who signed up for jobs at the new hub never saw those regulatory policy shifts in headline news. For them, global trade politics arrived quietly, marked by fewer trucks pulling into the loading bays and shrinking rosters on the weekly shift sheets. Act 3. Who actually wins a forced labor tariff? Shein's deep reluctance to move its manufacturing core out of mainland China goes far beyond basic tariff arithmetic. The underlying mechanics of fast fashion demand an infrastructure that very few developing economies can match. China's supplier network can churn out millions of unique clothing styles in tiny initial batches operating on paper-thin margins as low as 1 yuan, or roughly 15 US cents per item. They reorder within days for 273 million global shoppers. As one factory manager in Guangzhou noted, many suppliers who previously tried moving production to Vietnam are already returning due to local efficiency bottlenecks. Base retained its massive operational pull. In mid-2025, Guangzhou municipal authorities explicitly warned Shein against subsidizing suppliers attempting to relocate abroad, protecting the dense garment clusters of Panyu district. By February 2026, founder Sky Zhu pledged over $1.5 billion toward building a next-generation supply chain system directly inside Guangdong province. In July 2026, the incentives shifted again when Washington introduced a strict new tariff regime targeting forced labor in supply chains. The policy split Southeast Asia into 2 distinct tiers. Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines were placed in a higher 12.5% duty bracket. Meanwhile, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Malaysia secured a lower 10% bracket alongside crucial 3-year duty-free quotas linked to US cotton purchases. Official trade data from early 2026 highlights this divide. Between January and May, US apparel import data showed Cambodia becoming the fastest-growing major supplier, with exports surging nearly 15% in value and 18% in volume. Indonesia saw value growth exceed 5%, while Vietnam, still the region's top total exporter, saw its apparel growth flatten to barely 1.5%. The exact same trade policy produces completely opposite economic realities depending on where you sit in the region. For a garment factory owner in Jakarta or Phnom Penh, The forced labor compliance framework acts as a powerful commercial tailwind. But for a warehouse worker outside Ho Chi Minh City, it provides one more compelling reason for Shein to double down on its caution. Act 4. Two ledgers, same policy. When policy shifts hit the ground, human consequences land unevenly across borders. Looking at the two regional ledgers reveals just how starkly a single regulatory decision can divide outcomes for working communities. On the downside of the ledger, if Chinese suppliers continue pulling back their secondary operations from Vietnam, the cutbacks in Ho Chi Minh City won't stay isolated. A reduced corporate lease appears as a routine adjustment in executive filings. But for a local line worker whose hours are cut, it immediately translates into missed rent or delayed remittance back to their home village. 2 countries over, that same policy environment opens a critical transitional window. Cambodia's garment and travel goods sector supports over 1.1 million workers, over 72% of whom are women, across nearly 1,900 factories. With Cambodia set to graduate out of least developed country status in the coming years, local industry leaders recognize that competing solely on rock-bottom wages is no longer a viable long-term strategy. The new tariff quotas grant Cambodian manufacturers a rare, policy-backed window to move upmarket into high-compliance, reliable production before their low-wage advantage disappears completely. Indonesia, anchored by Southeast Asia's largest domestic textile ecosystem valued at roughly $42 billion, is positioned to make that exact same structural pivot at an even larger scale. Yet none of these regional gains are guaranteed for long. The duty-free trade quotas are capped at 3 years, and political administrations in Washington can rewrite international trade rules far faster than regional supply chains can retool. For now, the same regulatory instrument that shuttered warehouse bays outside Ho Chi Minh City has created unprecedented market access in Phnom Penh. Act 5, the fine print deciding Southeast Asia's next decade. For years, the standard narrative surrounding regional supply chains focused on China plus one, describing a straightforward, one-directional migration of manufacturing out of China and straight into Vietnam. That simple narrative is officially out of date. What we are witnessing today is not just a commercial contest between China and Southeast Asia, but an intense competition inside ASEAN itself. Washington's supply chain compliance rules have unintentionally begun sorting Southeast Asian economies against one another, dividing established manufacturing hubs from fast-moving challengers competing for the exact same capital flows. Vietnam is hardly losing its industrial edge tomorrow. It remains the region's largest apparel exporter to the United States by a wide margin. And Shein's warehouse downsizing reflects one corporate pivot rather than an economic collapse. However, Vietnam now finds itself defending its lead against neighbors like Cambodia and Indonesia, both leveraging targeted tariff edges that Vietnam simply does not hold. What lingers after the warehouse gates near Ho Chi Minh City close for the day is not really a question about Shein. It is a question about whether any single Southeast Asian economy can hold on to a safe alternative label for very long in a policy environment being rewritten every few months by a trading partner 8,000 miles away. I am Hiro the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN Angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.